Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this video? Well, we talk about the hobby. Sometimes it's the lore, sometimes it's the evolution of the ranges, sometimes it's a retrospect on the hobby itself, sometimes it's a battle company challenge, and occasionally a painting tutorial. But today we're going to be talking very specifically about Marneus Calgar. Yes, the chapter master of the Ultramarines chapter, and he's also what we will be painting today. And I was originally going to do an evolution of the Space Marine range over the years, since we've done the Necrons, we've done Orcs, and we've sort of done Imperial Guard as well. But I thought it'd be more interesting and a bit more appropriate to talk about the evolution of the Space Marines almost from the perspective of one model. Because you've got to remember, Calgar has had a lot of iterations, and you can almost chart the entire history of the evolution of the Space Marines purely through the models of Marneus Calgar. So that's what we're going to do today. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Well, let's go back to the very beginning and quickly talk about Marneus Calgar and who he is today. Marneus Calgar, for the few of you who don't know this, is the chapter master of the Ultramarines, the Blue Space Marines that are the beginner chapter for basically everyone everywhere. He's also one of the oldest named characters in the lore, and he's had 4 iterations of him in different models and in different materials, which is quite rare. He's been in metal, fine cast and plastic, all of which convey and give you an idea as to how many iterations of this model there have been. And I was half tempted to do a video about the evolution of Space Marines over the years, but it felt like we could do all this just talking about it through the lens of Marneus Calgar. And his journey starts way back in 1988, during the era of Rogue Trader. That's right. By this point, Rogue Trader had been around for about 3 years, and this was before he was named as well. He was just known as the Space Marine Commander model, with his sitting down pose, his one bodyguard, and his cloak hanging off a coat stand, which is quite quaint looking back at it now. And the original metal model was very minimalist, much like the early Space Marines, and they had a very different but recognisable aesthetic overall. As I said, they were far more minimalist. The beaky helmets, which have pervaded and are now known as the Mark 6 armour, were very prominent back then. And this was also the era before things like vehicles, before the Space Marines had a lot of their lore or their history, so this really was a founding time for them. And the best way to think of the Marneus Calgar model from those years, like the Space Marine range as a whole, is very much the baseline of what Space Marines would evolve and end up being. They were the starting point, the beginning of everything that would come later. And in many respects, you can still see that reflected through models all the way up to the Primaris nowadays. And you have to remember that this was a time before we started seeing things like chapter decals in much detail, before we started seeing huge ornamentation and decoration on armour. Everything, as I said, was far more stripped back and a lot more minimal in design. And in some respects, that was where we started to see the original aesthetic of the Grim Dark, which was far more about a cyberpunk or sci-fi punk look at how everyone is dressed and how everyone is armoured. It's less about being highly decorated or having lots of details. It's more about a very brutal, minimalist feel of making warfare and looking like you're more there to do a job rather than trying to express anything else about yourself or the culture you come from, as we see in much later editions. And it tells a much less of a story in some respects. But arguably you could also say it still tells a story, but just a very different one. And then, of course, you have to remember that as the Grimdark was only being established now, a lot of the important lore things didn't exist. The Horus Heresy didn't exist, the Space Marine chapters and the Legions didn't exist, Chaos Space Marines wouldn't be around for another couple of years, and as a result it was a very exciting and very entrepreneurial and very ambitious time for Games Workshop, where the rules were still being defined as to what this universe would be, and it could have gone in a very different direction considering where everything was back then to how it is now. But obviously, we mighty spacemen of the future see how things go and how things changed over the years. And then that brings us on to the next time jump for Marneus Calgar, when we saw him again in 1993. And this, interesting enough, is where he got his name for the first time around, Marneus Calgar. And the thing about the Space Marines of the early 90s compared to those of the late 80s is that's where we really start to see the Space Marines that we recognise today. The design was a bit less minimalist, there was more detail and more decoration on the armour. The poses, whilst there were many monopose miniatures to begin with, the models were becoming a bit bulkier and a bit bigger as well. And this is one of the things which doesn't get talked about much when it comes to talking about model design, but technology really does come along leaps and bounds. And in some respects, each new iteration of Marneus Calgar does show a new step forward in technology. The first Marneus Calgar and the second Marneus Calgar were both made of metal, but the second Marneus Calgar had far more detail on him. He had the shoulder pad, which was the Aquila. He had the chapter symbol of the Ultramarines emblazoned on his armour as part of the model. His face was more detailed. He was actually slightly bigger than even if he had been standing up. And overall, there was far more depth and a much richer model overall. This was to do with technology, this was also to do with resources, and it was to do with the individual artists as well changing, I believe. And as a result, you can't obviously then have to think everything else that changed with it. By the time we got to the second edition, we had the Space Marines as we know them now, and the Chaos Space Marines had recently been introduced. And as such, the Ultramarines had been established, and the concept of chapters and chapter masters and the Codex Astartes were starting to come into their own. So in many respects, a lot of what came with that, the idea of there being ranks delineating individual characters, but also chapters having their own personalities, was starting to come through. But you have to remember that even back then in 1993, Space Marines had gone from being lots of custom chapters, lots of different colour schemes granted, but now we were starting to see Space Marine chapters that had more backstory, that had more of an impact in the lore, and that's when we started to see the names of what would become the Space Marine first founding legions. The Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves all began to appear around about this time. Although actually I believe the Space Wolves were 3rd edition, but at this time the Blood Angels and Dark Angels had definitely arrived. And you have to remember that the only real way to distinguish Space Marine chapters at this point was largely through paint job. So whilst even the Dark Angels did have 1 or 2 characters who were in model cast, if you wanted to get anything particularly distinctive, it was all done in paint. Otherwise the models, the equipment and everything else was more or less exactly the same. And also the other thing to remember is that you start to see the visible differences across the Space Marine range at the time from when it was there before, as I said. But at the same time, the Space Marine lore was becoming more defined, and obviously the first Black Library novels began to be published around about this time, and you have to remember that the technology at the time was obviously far more limited in the early 90s. So many characters, many classic characters such as the old Dante, the old Mephiston, models which were in circulation until very recently, I might remind you, really are callbacks to those times where the only real differences you had were your figureheads. Your characters were what defined the tone of your army, rather than the whole army being what set the tone of the army. And obviously, this lasted for a long time, a full 10 years in fact. From 1993, this Marneus Calgar model was on the shelves and easily accessible. But it's also worth talking about the other things that happened around this time, between 1993 and the early 2000s. The Lord of the Rings game towards the end of that period made Games Workshop explode into the public consciousness before disappearing again a few short years later. So things such as Necromunda, Mordheim, Blood Bowl, Battlefleet Gothic, Epic, all had their heyday at this time as well. They were all very much in the public consciousness, and they were at their absolute peak at this time before the early 2000s. And this was all presided over by Marneus Calgar. That 1993 model, that small Space Marine in his power armor, was still there for all of this. And the thing that's worth mentioning before we move on is that even now that model does still look okay. It's not exactly what you'd call the most jaw-dropping model ever made, especially not when you compare it to models that have been released just this very year. But ultimately, it is still worth noting that his model hasn't dated that badly over the years, which is a real testament both to the longevity of the Space Marine designs, the work of the artists obviously, and also how much of an icon that he became and how iconic Space Marines became to Games Workshop at this time as well. But ultimately, time makes the fool of all of us, and in his next edition, Marneus Calgar went from looking good to looking great. I am of course talking about the 2005 Marneus Calgar, and the first thing you'll probably see when it comes to looking at the 4th edition Calgar is the sheer difference in size. But the other thing, before we get onto that, there's something else that came with him, and that was the Honor Guard. Now, right over the 90s and the early 2000s, and continuing after this, what we started to see more and more of were kits being released by Games Workshop specifically for the Space Marines that had an aesthetic that was more divergent from what we were used to. Everything we've spoken to and talked about up till now, every Space Marine Codex and every Space Marine army was differentiated largely by colour scheme. The models, the equipment, everything else was still very much the same. The only difference would be when we get to our previous one in 1993, suddenly we had characters, all of whom had their own unique aesthetic, but they were all chapter specific in many ways. But that was good, because that did start to give all the chapters a very good and clear identity unto themselves, and in some respects that meant that your figurehead, if not every unit in your army, as I said earlier, would start to set the tone of your army. But now we were starting to see, if not core units, elite units starting to do that as well, in the form of the Ultramarines Honor Guard, and also the Tyrannic War Veterans that came out at around a similar time. And you have to remember that this was the time where we started to see the core cast of Ultramarines characters expand a little bit. Tigerius had already made his debut back in 1995, I believe, and they were now joined by Orden Cassius, and obviously the aforementioned Honor Guard and Tyrannic War Veterans. So the Ultramarines actually had quite a large number of kits and characters that were unique to just their chapter, more so than some of the other chapters at this time as well. The only exceptions obviously being the Space Wolves, who even back then still had about 5 or 6 characters. The Blood Angels, interestingly enough, still only had 4 characters at this time, but the fact that the Ultramarines, in terms of kits if nothing else, were still on par with all of those is where we do start to see the transformation. But also in the build-up to this and what came after it, what we can also see is that divergence away from all Space Marines having a homogenized look that can only be changed through colour scheme. The aesthetics are changing. By this point, the Blood Angels had the Death Company, the Dark Angels had the Deathwing and Ravenwing, the Space Wolves had a codex which was completely different in many respects to the entire Space Marine codex, as being something completely different and utterly divergent. And everything that happened in this from this period onwards would very much start to see Space Marine chapters in many ways moving away from each other, as customizability and changing of the models and the sprues and kit bashing and conversion all really did begin to come into their own. And this is another thing to remember, from the Rogue Trader years up until 2004, a lot of the models you'd see would be scratch built, they'd be converted, but kit bashing really began to come into its own with the increased number of plastic kits and more modular kits across a lot of the Games Workshop ranges. The plastic kits had always been more modular up to this point anyway, but now we really started to see them coming to their own, and we start to see them being able to be used across the board with much more frequency and with much greater results. And the other thing to remember is that if we get back to the model, we also start to see a very big shift in the overall aesthetic of the Space Marine. Now, the interesting thing to talk about Marneus Calgar at this point, if you go back to that 1988 model, and then you fast forward to the 2004 model, you'd be forgiven for thinking that absolutely everything had changed. But the important thing to remember is in that 1993 model, we started to see more details, more campaign badges, more honours, more things that marked him out not just as a commander, but as a warlord in his own right. And that began to translate more into this new model, where ultimately you could say that this was the most detailed model Marneus Calgar's ever really had. Arguably, even the Primaris version today doesn't have quite as much surface area covered just in pure gold that the metal one of the 4th edition and 5th edition years did. And this is something which began to apply to other models. Obviously, the Ultramarines Honor Guard that he was with definitely had this as well. And then other characters, such as Dante, definitely had this going on for him. And the Space Marines, on the whole, changed as well. A few years prior, we'd seen a new Tactical Squad kit come out, and the Space Marines from that Tactical Squad, even though they were still fairly minimalist, there was more details on the armour. There were more eagles on their chests. There were more decoration on the shoulder pads. The weapons had a bit more on them as well, so we were starting to see little badges and aquillas on the bolt guns. The backpacks had little skulls on them as well. And Space Marine, things like Space Marine Veterans and Terminators all started to have more campaign honours and more badges across the model. So ultimately there was more detail on all the models, which is again technology and artistry evolving. But when you look at Marneus Calgar being the pinnacle of this, it's easy to see how this began to disseminate, and how, as I said earlier, we began to see this divergence within the chapters. And knowing that this amount of detail was possible on models at this point is something which is really worth mentioning, because it really did pave the way for everything that came next. Now, as I said about Marneus Calgar, who came around in 1993, this iteration of Calgar also oversaw an enormous change in Space Marines. I'd argue a bigger change that, whilst 1993 Calgar saw the rise of the specialists and smaller games, in some respects this Calgar very much saw the decline of them before their resurrection. Blood Bowl, Necromunda, Mordheim all began to disappear from the shelves around about 2006, 2007 sort of time. Battlefleet Gothic disappeared, Epic disappeared, and Games Workshop's aim was very much to focus on the two main games, Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k. But ultimately, whilst a lot of things did disappear, a lot of things started to appear. In 40k, for example, we began to see things such as Flyers, Super Heavies, and the Apocalypse game and Planet Strike come out. There were different ways to play 40k that were being explored. Many of the armies began to be expanded upon in ways which they hadn't really been before. Virtually every army got a new codex. Dark Eldar, Drakari now, Orcs, Tyranids all began to appear. And as the editions wore on, we began to see new armies being birthed almost out of the old ones. The Imperial Knights and the Adeptus Mechanicus both made a long overdue arrival in 40k. The Harlequins split off from the Eldar and formed their own codex. And obviously the Genestealer cult came and took up their own space, which also brought us the first plastic Ultramarines character in the form of Orton Cassius leading his Deathwatch kill team. And all of this obviously was then massively overshadowed by the juggernaut that was the Horus Heresy. Heresy. And that again changed everything. It changed how people looked at Space Marines. It changed how they look at 40k. And I would still argue that the Horus Heresy is the single most influential thing to happen, if not to 40k, but definitely to the Space Marines in all of their history. And that's something we'll be coming back to shortly. And you have to remember that this was the longest time Marneus Calgar went without receiving an update previously. It had been 5 years both times round, 1988 to 1993, and then 10 years from 1993 to 2004, 2005, 11 years depending on precisely when the model came out. But ultimately, this Marneus Calgar was around for a neat 14 years. Which, bearing in mind that 40k has only been around for about 40 years, is a very long time for one model. And it's even more impressive that this model, like the old one, is actually still a very impressive model to look at. Yes, this model was only available in metal and in Finecast. It did go through that evolution, but ultimately it was still and remains a very good model. Even next to the newer Calgar, it's not as big, it's not as imposing, but it still looks very good and very presentable. And even though that Marneus Calgar has now somewhat been lost to history along with its two previous iterations, it does still hold up in many respects. But this brings us on now to the big one, the most recent one, the Primaris Calgar. 2017, the year of 8th edition, the year of Primaris, the year that everything changed for Space Marines like never before. I'd say that the thing to remember about this is that this was a lot of chickens coming home to roost at once. It was very much all the lessons of the Horus Heresy, both for Games Workshop, in a lore, game, and even a sales perspective as well. The technology steps that had allowed things that would only ever have been exclusive to Forge World to start coming over into plastic. The final end of metal, in many respects, and the final end of Finecast as new releases for any other race in the future. As well as a huge upheaval into how the game is played as well, and in some respects a change to the current lore with the arrival of the Primaris. And the most important thing to remember about this time is that Marneus Calgar was the first existing named character to be remade in Primaris. Yes, there were the lieutenants for the Space Wolves, Blood Angels and Dark Angels that all did get Primaris models before Calgar came around, but everyone that came afterwards, Ragnar, Mephiston, Shrike, Corsaro Khan, whilst these were all still established characters who had older metal and or Finecast models from when they were firstborn models, Calgar was the first to make the leap from firstborn to Primaris, and also, importantly, from metal to plastic. There are other characters that were made in plastic before Calgar. If you look over at the Age of Sigmar shelf, characters such as Archaon, Alariel, Scarbrand, Kairos Fateweaver were all in plastic before Calgar was. And even Abaddon and even Guilliman were, I believe, plastic before Calgar was. But ultimately and significantly, Calgar was the first of the old crowd, the pre-2005 crowd, to be remade in plastic. And in some respects, you have to remember that there was a big gulf between that initial Calgar and the most recent one, but it was a jump he made rather well. He is much larger, much more imposing, but interestingly enough, we also start to see returns to the older aesthetics of what the Space Marines were as far back as Rogue Trader. Whilst he is still covered in many, many campaign honours and campaign badges, there is more blue showing on his armour. He's far less heavily gilded with all the gold decorations and all the details, and far more of his armour is given over to the metal plate, the plating of the power armour. His face is far more defined than it has ever been before. Overall, his size is bigger, as I have mentioned, but significantly as well is that he's far more dynamically posed than he's ever been before. Even in his previous two iterations, he did look somewhat static. In his most recent one from 2004, he did have some motion, but now he looks far more mobile because things such as the cloak, the way the armor is positioned, all looks far more like it's in motion, less like it's a statue, far less static and far more mobile. And whilst his pose is far more reminiscent of his 1993 iteration, ultimately you can still see the subsequent 20 to 25 years of change that came before we had Marneus Calgar as he is now. And the other thing to remember about that is that he still has the same face and most of the same icons and honours that have translated from his 1993 model through to the 2004 to the current one have all still remained. So whilst Marneus Calgar has changed in many ways, in some respects the man that Marneus Calgar is has remained the same. There is consistency to him, there is a stability in the model to know that this is still the same Calgar. Games Workshop haven't abandoned the aesthetic and therefore haven't abandoned the backstory of this Primaris Chapter Master, even though he has undergone several transformations. And in some respects that's a hats off to Games Workshop for at least acknowledging its history and holding its continuity, at least with some respect, when it comes to this character.
and it's harder to make the same comparison for other characters. Even though, yes, characters such as Cassius have had a few different iterations, as has Tigerius, both of them have had a little bit less to work with over the years simply because they don't have the same history. Ragnar Blackmane and Mephiston both didn't receive updates for many, many years. Dante and Azrael will have to wait even longer before they see new models. But ultimately, the fact that Calgar has been updated 4 times in nearly 35 years is a very long time, but it's also very heartwarming to know that this is the same Marneus Calgar in many respects throughout this entire time. And I would say that the thing about every Space Marine wanting to be an Ultramarine, which is a phrase I used to hear quite a lot when I started in the hobby, it's quite easy to see that with Marneus Calgar. In many respects, he's the first Space Marine. He's the first character to get updated each edition. He's the first chapter master that people tend to see when they start looking at their Space Marines. And in many respects, he is the trendsetter for the changes in divergence from what Space Marines were before to whatever they will be in the future. And for those of you who have watched my video about how influential the Ultramarines have been, the thing you have to remember is that there's no such thing as a generic Space Marine. The Ultramarines have always had personality. They just happen to be where most players start. They just happen to be the chapter that is on the introductory box. And that's fine. But that doesn't make them generic. It doesn't make them vanilla. It doesn't mean that they have nothing special or unique going for them. Because as characters such as Calgar, Ventress, Sicarius, Tigerius should all show, the Ultramarines have things that make them distinctive from all the other chapters. And Marneus Calgar has always been the trendsetter. Always remember this: whenever Marneus Calgar is released, other characters will follow. It's seldom the other way around. And that's always worth remembering going forward. And whatever the future holds for the Space Marines, if they will evolve again, if things will disappear or reappear, I'm fairly certain that the first person that's going to make the change, whatever it may or may not be, is going to be Marneus Calgar. But as always, let me know your thoughts below. What do you think of Primaris Calgar and Calgar throughout the years? Do you think he's aged well? Do you think they should have kept with the original aesthetic of him sitting down? Do you think that they should release that model perhaps in Primaris form? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
So, that is a plotted history of the Space Marines through the lens of Marneus Calgar himself. And let me know your thoughts below. Do you agree with what I've said about Calgar? Do you think that it's been slightly different for him? But in any case, whilst you're commenting below, like, subscribe, hit the bell button, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. And whilst you're down there as well, check out my Patreon, my website for the sorts of services I provide, and maybe my Instagram if you just want to see some pictures of toy soldiers. But thank you all very much for watching. My videos are posted on Wednesdays and Fridays. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.